Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being with us today for our Halaloween Roundtable, Beyond the Films, Muslim Horror in the 21st Century. My name is Aliyah Khan, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, in the Department of English and the Department of Afro-American African Studies. I'm also the director of the Global Islamic Studies Center at the International Institute. We're your hosts for today. First, a little bit about us and about the Halaloween series. The Global Islamic Studies Center aims to promote the understanding of global Islamic culture and Muslim societies worldwide, not just the Middle East, but also Asia, Africa, and the Americas. If you're a Michigan student wanting to get involved with our center, please attend our events. But also, if you're an undergraduate student, declare our Islamic Studies minor. The minor itself has no prerequisites and is 16 credits. You can find out more information on our minor page on our website, but please reach out and contact us and we can make sure you have everything you need. If you're interested in graduate programs, check out our Masters in International and Regional Studies with an Islamic Studies specialization. The application deadline is usually mid-December, and you can also find more info on our website. The master's program is 36 credits total and is usually pursued over the course of 2 years. If you're a student, faculty, staff, or community member interested in our events, please join our newsletter. We send out monthly newsletters and you can subscribe to it. Besides Halaloween, our other major event this semester is our Afghanistan series, featuring 3 events, 2 individual speakers, and a film. In September, we heard from Afghan scholar and assistant professor at Thomas Jefferson University, Ahmad Qais Munhazim, on queer Afghanistan. On November 10th, soon, we will hear from Anand Gopal, journalist and author of the book No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and a War Through Afghan Eyes. Mr. Gopal just returned from assignment in Afghanistan a few weeks ago. We'll also be streaming a women-made film on Afghanistan at the end of the semester. Today's Halaloween Roundtable, Beyond the Films, Muslim Horror in the 21st Century, is the culminating event for our Halaloween Muslim Horror film series, which took place throughout the month of October. We hosted the film festival on the screening platform Eventive and screened 1 film a week, released every Friday for the month of October, giving viewers the ability to watch on their own time. Halaloween screened horror films from Muslim majority countries that were made by, for, or about Muslims, with the hopes of understanding what scares Muslim audiences. Are horror movies halal? First launched by Global Islamic Studies at the Michigan Theater in person in 2019, featuring films like A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night from Iran, Dakhra from Tunisia, Sijin from Turkey, and more, Halaloween moved to an entirely virtual film series in 2021. This year, we featured films from Egypt, Malaysia, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia, with special attention to Islam in Asia, as well as the Middle East. The 2021 Halaloween lineup was on October 1st from Egypt, 122. Then we screened from Malaysia, KL24 Zombies, then from Morocco, Kandisha, then from Saudi Arabia, Madayan, then from Indonesia, Impedagor. We'd like to thank our Halaloween co-sponsors at the University of Michigan, the Department of Middle East Studies, the Department of Film, Television, and Media, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the Digital Islamic Studies Curriculum, the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, the Arab and Muslim American Studies Program in American Culture, the Institute for the Humanities, the Center for South Asian Studies, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and the African Studies Center. Our external co-sponsors are the Center for Arab American Studies at U of M Dearborn, the Arab American National Museum, and the AMC horror film streaming service Shudder. Today, we are delighted to welcome 5 scholars and experts to our Halaloween Roundtable on Muslim horror. I'll introduce the speakers, all of them now, in the order in which they will speak. If you all would like to turn on your videos so that people can see who you are. Karla Mallette is Professor of Mediterranean Studies in the Department of Middle East Studies and Professor of Italian in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at the University of Michigan. She's the author of The Kingdom of Sicily, 1100 to 1250, A Literary History in 2005, European Modernity and the Arab Mediterranean in 2010, and Lives of the Great Languages, Latin and Arabic in the Medieval Mediterranean from 2021. She has also written numerous articles on medieval literatures and Mediterranean studies. Karla is a former director of the Global Islamic Studies Center, as you will hear, and she is the current chair of the Department of Middle East Studies at U of M. Dr. Mallette will be speaking on the history of the Halaloween film series and the market expansion of Muslim horror, from jinn possession to gore to zombies. Dr. Kristian Petersen has written about Muslim American celebrity activism, female filmmakers, the rise of the Muslim sitcom, Hollywood depictions of Iraqis, and Muslim cinema. He is the editor of Muslims in the Movies, a global anthology from 2021, and New Approaches to Islam in Film, also from 2021. Dr. Petersen will be speaking on the category and genre of Muslim horror and what ties these disparate thematics together, considering their different countries of origins and themes. Sena Duran is a PhD candidate in the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan. Her work considers historical and contemporary depictions of Middle Eastern Muslims in film, with special attention to body genre films and effective responses among audiences. Her dissertation project currently identifies the genre and industry of adult film as central to the study of racial, sexual, gendered, and national discourses in US visual media productions of Middle Eastern Muslims. Sena will be speaking on the use of the Quran and prayer in our Saudi Halaloween film, Madayan, particularly prayer as protection and mitigation for viewers' fright and bodily reactions to horror. Dr. Alireza Doostdar is an associate professor of Islamic Studies and the Anthropology of Religion at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He is the author of The Iranian Metaphysicals, Explorations in Science, Islam, and the Uncanny from 2018, and is currently writing a book about the theology of Satan after the Islamic Revolution. Dr. Doostdar will be speaking on Islamic horror as spiritual and pedagogical cinema, with a focus on Ramadan serials in Iran. Dr. Alicia Izharuddin is currently a fellow at the International Institute for Asian Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where she is finishing her book on the print culture of romance in Malaysia and the formation of effective counterpublics. Dr. Izharuddin will be speaking on horror and feminism in Southeast Asia and the struggle between Islam and pre-Islamic animist beliefs, where the most iconic pre-Islamic supernatural beings are female. Each one of our speakers will speak for 8 to 10 minutes. At the end of the discussion, we will have time for Q&A from the audience. I will ask you to use the Q&A function in the webinar. Please welcome all of our speakers for what will be a fascinating discussion. We'll begin with Dr. Karla Mallette.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us. So yeah, as you just heard, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the series and what we have discovered about Muslim horror as a category in doing it. As you just heard, the series got its start in 2016 when we screened, 2019, when we screened 5 movies at the Michigan Theater here in Ann Arbor. Now, I'm a horror movie fan, but I didn't know anything about Muslim horror as a category until in 2017, when at Cinetopia, this is a film festival that takes place in Detroit and Ann Arbor. At Cinetopia, I saw The Worthy. It was actually screened at the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn. The Worthy is a 2016 movie directed by Ali Mustafa, who is a British Emirati filmmaker, and written by Vikram Wheat. This was a post-apocalyptic thriller about the survivors of a climate catastrophe that was both environmental and political. It had to do with water politics in particular. After we saw it, my friends and I spent the evening kind of picking it apart. It was in Arabic, but it felt like a recognizable Hollywood setup for a combination thriller and zombie movie. There's a small group of survivors fighting off the marauders who wanted their water. But at the same time, it was clearly a uniquely Middle Eastern spin on the post-apocalyptic movie with its emphasis on water politics. And the survivors of the apocalypse interpreted climate catastrophe through and the collapse of society through what was clearly a Quranic lens. So we were fascinated by it. So flash forward to 2019 when Hannah Mafar, the program coordinator for Islamic Studies, and I were sitting around and kind of spitballing, trying to figure out what, planning events for the following academic year. Halaloween started with me wondering out loud, could we put together a series of Muslim horror movies? Would people come if we did? And what would we call it? Hannah came up with a name, and the rest is history. Now, from the beginning, our goal was to try for global coverage. We didn't want only movies from the Middle East. We also didn't want movies that were too brutal or violent. So we never screened The Worthy, in part because that movie is just too violent. There is some gore in the movies that we screen, which you might have noticed if you've been watching them this year, but we steer clear of extreme body horror and torture porn. That's one of our ground rules. We also don't want movies that are too sexist, which is just dreary and no fun to watch. And as horror movie fans know well, horror movies, like most genre movies, can be incredibly misogynistic. Munafiq, I'm looking at you. This year, I'm happy to say that all of the movies that we're screening, with the exception of this week's movie, Medallion, all of them have a female protagonist, which is kind of interesting. And we wanted to keep the quality high. Everybody loves a good cheesy horror movie, but you need to draw the line somewhere. Now, I want to be clear that Muslim horror as a category is not really a thing. You could talk about Turkish horror because the Turks have their horror franchises. They have horror directors who've been very productive. You could also talk about Southeast Asian horror, and at least one person on this panel will talk about Southeast Asian horror. But I don't think that anybody before has ever tried to think about Muslim horror as a global category, a category of world cinema. There is a subgenre in the sphere of horror movies made by Muslim directors for a Muslim audience that has global range, though, and that is jinn possession movies. Sometimes these movies borrow tropes from Western possession movies like The Exorcist and the many, many movies that it spawned, but typically they dive deep into local lore. This year, Medallion is the only real jinn possession movie that we're showing. Medallion, directed by Ayman Tamano, is also the first horror movie from Saudi Arabia. You can still see it today and tomorrow if you get a chance, and I recommend it. You can definitely see the influence of the Blair Witch Project. It maps onto the found footage template, but in some ways it's different. You see glimpses of the Saudi heritage tourism industry, which is fascinating, as well as glimpses of the theological origin of jinn. And you get some good advice for resisting jinn, although, spoiler alert, it doesn't do the protagonists of the movie much good. And this is what we're going for with the series, movies that use horror as a global idiom, but that speak their own local language. This year, we were also proud to screen KL24 Zombie. From the beginning, we were kind of baffled by the absence of zombie movies in this emergent genre that we were exploring. If there is a genre of that directors of horror movies are using globally to think about issues from an overcrowded planet to colonialism to climate collapse, it's the zombie movie. And in fact, that was one of the questions that we had in 2019, that first year of Halaloween. We shared a series of questions with our audience, the same questions that you just heard from Alia. What scares Muslim audiences? Are horror movies halal? Why so many jinn? And where are the Muslim zombies? And we have an audience member to thank for pointing us to KL24. That movie, written and directed by James Lee, Shemaine Uthman, and Gavin Yap, is a Malaysian zombie movie that uses tropes familiar to Western audiences. It even has a final girl. But at the same time, there are family scenes in that movie that are completely unlike anything that you would see in an American horror movie. The conversations between the hijabi final girl and her fiance's family, who are ethnic Chinese, are a hoot. And this movie also gives us the classic line, "I don't want to be a zombie in my marriage," spoken by a wife of a guy who definitely does not deserve her. So in our first couple of years, we've served up lots of jinn possession movies. We have found a Muslim post-apocalyptic thriller, although we haven't screened it, you're welcome, and a Muslim zombie movie. Next on the wish list, I guess, is a Muslim slasher movie. I don't know of any. If you do, and you've got suggestions, send them to us. islamicstudies@umich.edu. Thanks and enjoy the movies. And happy Halloween, everybody.
I think I'm up next, if that is correct. I'm going to share my screen here in 1 second. All right. Everything coming through okay? Hope so. Anyway, thanks to Aliyah for inviting me and to the Global Islamic Studies Center. I'm excited to be in this conversation. And thanks to Hannah for making everything easier. It's been really great and easy to get things going here. I am not going to tackle that giant topic that Aliyah mentioned I would initially, partly because I was anticipating Karla's comments about the kind of typologies that we might have here in thinking about Muslim horror as a category. And really, I'm just glad to be in conversation. Everyone's topics are really great, so I'm excited to do that. What I figured I would do is kind of take a closer look at one of the films screened over this month, the film Kandisha, which was a 2008 film written and directed by Moroccan filmmaker Jerome Cohen Oliver. I don't have any conclusions, if that is fair to say, but I do have some questions. So first, part of what's going on in this film is it draws on this myth or legend of the figure Aisha Kandisha. It's a localized Moroccan folklore, which has various regional configurations. She is a jinn-like being, but with a specific developed personality. And we might think of her from a Western perspective, similar to the archetype of a Hollywood's femme fatale. In general, some descriptions, there's not a lot of scholarship or literature on this in English, but the Moroccan sociologist Fatima Marnarsi says, quote, "In Moroccan folk culture, this threat, referring to female sexuality, is epitomized by the belief in Aisha Kandisha, a repugnant female demon. She is repugnant precisely because she is libidinous. She has pendulous breasts and lips, and her favorite pastime is to assault men in the streets and in dark places, to induce them to have sexual intercourse with her, and ultimately to penetrate their bodies and stay with them forever. They are then said to be inhabited. The fear of Aisha Kandisha is more than ever present in Morocco's daily life. Fear of the castrating female is a legacy of tradition and is seen in many forms of popular beliefs and practices in both religious and mundane literature." And one other description I found was from a 19th century English traveler, Edward Westermarck, who described Aisha Kandisha saying, "She appears in various shapes, now as a child, now as a grown-up woman, with long hair and a beautiful face, but with legs of a goat or an ass. She knows the name of every man, but when she calls anybody, he should not answer her, for she is very dangerous. Not only does she kill men, she is also sometimes said to eat them." So this is kind of the background here. The film Kandisha takes this as a kind of foundational part of the plot. So for folks who didn't see this film, the film, and spoilers ahead here, so apologies if you're hoping to check it out. is about an attorney named Neela Jade who is summoned by a strange woman to a very strange case. Neela meets the defendant, Mona Bendrisi, who is accused of killing her husband. Mona professes her innocence and claims the legendary Kandisha cut her husband's head off. Neela investigates, seeking the help of both law enforcement colleagues and a local Kabbalist and storyteller. All the while, Neela is struggling mentally after the death of her own daughter and interpersonally in her marriage. She fails to take her medication, which blurs the lines of reality and dream throughout the film. After some mysterious clues, Neela discovers other seemingly related unsolved murders, another decapitated man, and a mother and daughter who were drowned. Ultimately, Neela defends Mona in court, arguing that the spirit was responsible for the murder, but a resolution is never established in the film. However, the final shots connect Kandisha, who has now also avenged the drowned mother and daughter by decapitating her husband, connected her with the Kabbalists, thus furthering doubt about the supernatural nature of this violent disciplining of patriarchal oppression. So in the film, Kandisha is depicted or narrated through this story told by the Kabbalist. And in these, she's shown kind of from this mythology decapitating men. She appears as a woman in white to Neela here. In other scenes, she's identified as a just force that punishes husbands who oppress and abuse their wives. And as I mentioned, in the end, she's revealed to be the Kabbalist, which is a great topic, and maybe we can get to it later, but one I'm not going to focus on here. So how might we think about Kandisha? And one approach might be to think about it through these kind of regional Muslim horrors, like the Pan Tianak that Alicia is going to talk about, I believe, or through these kind of configurations that Karla, and I like this wording, I think you said something along the lines as horror as a global idiom, but speaking their own language. So that would be one take. I decided to think about it within the context of gender and horror tropes, and thinking about it through the lens of this category of the final girl that Karla mentioned previously. So for those of you that aren't familiar with this, Carol Clover, in her essay, Her Body Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film, which was published in 1987, incorporated in her classic book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film. She looks at slasher films of the 70s and 80s primarily, Halloween kind of being one of the epitomes of this analysis, and she theorizes about the final girl. And in these early iterations, the final girl is a smart, resourceful young lady, originally very often a virgin, and one that ultimately defeats the monster in the film. More recent embodiments use sexuality as a tool for power and accomplishing the defeat of the monster, and has really become more popularized since Buffy the Vampire Slayer series and film from the 90s. So the final girl trope refocuses the spectator towards a female point of view, creating an empowered hero who has complete agency in overcoming her adversaries. So I wanted to know, is it productive to think about Kandisha as the final girl, perhaps in its newer archetypal form, which has pivoted towards greater female agency? I don't know if this is the best avenue forward, but this is what I did. So Kandisha herself is not defined by her victimhood, but rather her exacting force in brutal justice, which is contrary to the dominant historical final girl trope, although perhaps it's not in more recent iterations. The film also does not sexualize any of the female protagonists, including Kandisha, whose broader myth, as I mentioned, is rooted in the efficacy of her sexual prowess. But the film certainly does realign the spectator away from the dominant male gaze in order to empathize with the women of the film. So in the end, for me at least, Kandisha is both villain and victim, monster and final girl, and therefore subverts the easy classification in horror genre categories. Since the film makes us simultaneously terrified of Kandisha and empathize with her, we must step back to confront the larger social norms that have both produced her and prolong her continuing activity. Patriarchal social norms, systematic misogyny, gendered trauma, violence against women, and the horrors of the male oppression of women. So I'll leave it there and hope to continue the conversation moving forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Petersen. I am next, I think. So let me very quickly share my screen. And hopefully everything is showing up correctly. So my presentation today is I Seek Refuge in Allah, Sounds and Operations of Prayer in Muslim Horror. About halfway through the 2016 Saudi Arabian horror film Madayan, which follows the making of a documentary on the allegedly haunted city of Madayan Saleh, the documentary film crew receive a warning by their tour guide on the presence of jinn in the necropolis. Al-Hakim, the director and token skeptic of the group, brushes off the stories. The guide assures the more cautious Khalid and the cameraman Qurashi that they may, in the worst case scenario, overcome the possession of the jinn by reciting the Quran. As he warns them, quote, "When a human travels with faith in his heart, no harm will come to them. Pray for it to be gone, and it will be." As the crew enters the 2 minutes later, Qurashi guides the camera and with it the audience through its lens, through the entrance with the prayer, "A'udhu billah, Allah protect me." As part of the larger canon of Muslim horror films on the subject of jinn, as Dr. Mallette spoke to in the introduction of this roundtable, Madayan operates both as an homage to and a uniquely Saudi adaptation of the mockumentary Possession. But in the consideration of the narrative structure and vocabulary of the film, Madayan's invocation of prayer as protection, however futile it ended up being in the long run of the movie, operated as a useful introduction to the subject of prayer and the operation of Islamic theology in a subset of Muslim horror. Over the course of this presentation, I used Madayan as a case study for approaching the use of Muslim prayer in horror film, with specific attention to how the recitation of prayer has operated as part of cinematic soundscapes in both its invocation and mitigation of the audience's terror. Specifically, rather than focusing on the visual elements of the cinema, I instead identify the centrality of Muslim prayer as sound effect in horror film to both identify how it has operated in constructing fear in more mainstream Hollywood horror films in comparison to Muslim horror films like Madayan, and the bodily and spiritual possibilities that prayer in Muslim horror may offer for audiences. To do so, I first begin with a brief survey of how signals of prayer and Islamic faith have been used in Hollywood films featuring Muslim monsters, like the 1973 The Exorcist, where the sound of the adhan, or the call to prayer, have been explicitly used to indicate and identify the presence of the monster as both supernatural and ethno-religious other. I speak on The Exorcist in particular to identify its use of Islamic prayer in the audible marking of the demonic monster, in specific comparison to Madayan's use of Islam as both explanation of and protection against the jinn. In the second half of this presentation, I pay due to the horror film as a genre, specifically as a body genre by film scholar Linda Williams' definition, and think about the visceral implications of prayer in Muslim horror when we consider audience reception. So within the period of Hollywood horror cinema that William Whittington identifies as the post-psycho era, the 60s, 70s, and 80s marked a notable but not necessarily unique shift in horror narratives involved in more violent, exploitative, and socially conscious considerations of American socioeconomic and international anxieties. These often involved films deliberately situating their monsters as having Muslim and often vaguely and generalizably Middle Eastern and North African origins to emphasize their monstrous difference from the American and often white human protagonist. In the case of The Exorcist, which follows the possession of a young girl in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., the film's 10-minute prologue identifies northern Iraq as the birthplace and origin of the central demon Pazuzu. The prologue, in addition to geographically situating the birth and release of the film's antagonist, additionally reappears as a signal of monstrosity throughout the film. And it's here that sound, and the sound of Islamic prayer in particular, operates most explicitly. As The Exorcist opens with the sound of the adhan, the call to prayer, an oral signal of Iraq's religious as well as ethno-racial distinction, is perhaps the most salient mode through which the film informs and identifies the presence of the demon for its audience. In the film's final scene, after the demon has been exorcised, the audience is given permission to relax explicitly because the source of horror has been dispelled from the literal grounds of the nation's capital. You can see it here. In the conclusion of the 2000 re-release of the film, though, the camera still focuses on the streets as proof of the demon's demise, but we hear the call of the adhan again, faint and short-lived, lasting only a few seconds, but distinctly jarring in its new US location. In its call to Iraq in the prologue, the adhan takes the place of the demon and its indication of that which does not belong or has infiltrated. The adhan as an auditory marker emerges as a leitmotif, its presence as a sensory texture so indicative of the demon that its re-emergence disrupts the calm that the Georgetown conclusion once promised. And the survival of the demon, or the continued possibility of its threat, becomes insinuated through the use of the sound of Islamic prayer. While The Exorcist is not unique in this regard, the 1987 Hellraiser, for instance, similarly opens and ends with the sound of the adhan as the puzzle box which summons the sadomasochistic Cenobite race of monsters is inexplicitly tethered to Morocco. It does indicate how Muslim prayer can and has operated within the soundscape of Muslim represented in horror film. In contrast, I think what we can find especially productive about the operation of prayer in Muslim-produced horror films like Medallion is the possibility for nuanced, or at the very least an exciting operation of Muslim prayer in horror, where its use indicates that something terrifying or unfamiliar may appear at any moment, but does not in and of itself operate as an audible indicator of monstrosity through difference. In these contexts, Islamic theology becomes both an explanation of the supernatural or terrifying presence of the existence of jinn, for instance, and as a mode of protection. In the case of Medallion, the only material means of protection against the possible and proven existence of jinn at Medallion Sada is through prayer. So the subtitles accompanying the film pick up on the cameraman Qurashi's continual utterances of prayer, often asking Allah to protect him and his crew, and often chastising the skeptic Hakim for not taking the paranormal presence in the site seriously. And I believe it's possible to read Hakim's skepticism as partially responsible for why he was the first to be approached and possessed by the jinn, spoiler alert, sorry, a failure to take the tour guide's advice and the recitation of the Quran seriously. In any case, what is distinctive about the utilization of prayer in Medallion is that it does not operate to identify ethno-religious difference as central to the making and monstrosity of its monsters, as it has been the case in the few and some Hollywood predecessors. While this has so far identified the representational strategies on screen, I want to turn here as a means of conclusion to thinking about the operation of prayer in films like Medallion when we specifically attend to genre of horror, especially as film scholars have identified the affective and bodily responses of horror viewers. I'm especially indebted to Linda Williams' identification of horror as a body genre here. So by body genre, Williams not only identifies how horror is involved in the spectacle of a body caught in the grip of intense sensation or emotion. So in the case of horror, its portrayal of violence against and the terror felt by the characters, but further argues that body genre films lack a proper aesthetic distance between the viewer and the image in the film, resulting in a sense of over-involvement in sensation and emotion. That is, a successful body genre film is, quote, measured by the degree to which the audience's sensation mimics what is seen on screen, end quote. If a horror film is successful, if it's done its job as a horror film, then the spectator will actually break out into sweat, get goosebumps, or scream in fright. By identifying horror film as a body genre in this way, I think it's then possible to consider another aspect of prayer as protection in Muslim horror, not only in the service it provides for the characters on screen, but in its possibility of bringing physical bodily relief to audience members. For those viewers who may be familiar with the theology behind creatures such as the jinn, and for whom the invocation of the Quran or making dua has also been taught as a method of protection, I think it's productive to think about the cinematic use of prayer as resulting in material, bodily relief and sensation for certain audiences. That is, I think it may be beneficial to consider horror not as a tangential and fringe genre without merit, but actually through its specific mode of entertainment through terror, one that might invoke attention or reminder of spirituality in its affective and sensational effects. I actually watched Madayan with my roommate as part of the Halaloween Film Fest, and I tell this story with her consent, but at a particularly tense moment in a pseudo jump scare, the both of us really did scream, and her immediate reaction was to say, "A'udhu billah," and we were making dua while the cameraman was making dua in turn. It was a whole experience for us, but I think this indicates the operative possibilities that horror as a body genre can provide. In the invocation of prayer on screen, the body and experience of the spectator does not go untouched or without sensation. In certain cases, and for certain audience members, we can consider the operative use of prayer as protection for the characters on screen to similarly have an effect for the viewers watching. Often, I think when we think about horror, we're struck by the fear that it invokes in us and lingers long after the film has ended. But it's in my hope that through this consideration of prayer and its operation within the body genre of the horror film, I've spoken to the nuance and the complex sensational affects of horror that makes this genre so exciting, and especially fruitful when we consider Muslim horror. Thank you so much.
Hello, I think I'm next. My name is Alireza Doostdar. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to the University of Michigan for the invitation. This has been such a wonderful event and a wonderful panel. I especially appreciate the discussion, Sena Duran's presentation just now, because it actually presents a nice segue for what I'm going to talk about. Let me just see if I can share my screen here. All right, hopefully that's working okay. So I'm an anthropologist by training, and I've been doing some work on horror television serials made in Iran, particularly during the month of Ramadan. And my approach is an anthropological one, which means that I'm not just interested in what the content of these shows are, or in general what the content of horror films might be, but I'm also interested in asking what the intention of the filmmakers might be. What work is the film supposed to do? You know, is it only there to thrill and entertain the viewers? Is it offering social commentary of some sort? Is it presenting criticism? Or are there other objectives perhaps that the film might pursue? So I think in some of the films that we've been watching for Halaloween, there are certainly kind of modes of social criticism that one might read into them. I think Professor Petersen's presentation suggested some avenues where that might be the case with regard to gender in Kandisha, for instance. Another anthropological question, which I think Sena's talk just now got into, is how are these films actually received, right? And that is an empirical question. You might have to actually go out into the world and see how people are watching these films. How do they respond to the films in light not just of its contents, but also in relation to what that content is supposed to do. So what kinds of expectations do people have of a horror film when they're watching it, and does it actually succeed? Right. So if it's supposed to terrify, does it actually do that? If it's supposed to do other things, does it actually succeed in doing those other things? So one of those other things is spiritual instruction and edification. And that's what I've been interested in looking at horror-themed television series made in Iran. So since 2004, Iranian state television has been producing a subsection of horror TV shows made in Iran which have been broadcast during the month of Ramadan in particular. What distinguishes these TV shows is that they're meant to enrich viewers' spiritual lives and remind them of realities transcending the material and the mundane, right? So during Ramadan, there's often a range of different kinds of TV shows that are broadcast. Different channels do different shows. Some of them are comedies, some of them are family dramas. There's police procedurals, and then you have the spiritual TV shows. The ones that have been produced since around 2004, and there's maybe 8 or 9 of them so far, they tend to have some kind of horror theme, and it's almost always supernatural horror. So they include disincarnated souls, the souls of the dead kind of wandering around making demands or trying to do things in the world. There's angels and demons, there's heaven and hell. Sometimes there are extraordinary powers like extrasensory vision and mystical healing, those sorts of things. And almost always these elements are combined in some way with other television genres. So there's family drama, there might be police procedurals or medical fiction, and those are kind of built into the sort of broader spiritual horror frame. So I'll give you a few examples here. What you see here is a frame from a show that was, if I remember correctly, is from 2005 called Uyek Ferishte Bud, She Was an Angel, where a young woman, a man accidentally runs over this young woman in the dark of night, and then brings her home and to his family in order to help her recover. And gradually it turns out that she's actually Satan. And she sort of shows all kinds of supernatural abilities, but also starts to do really nasty things like seduce the main character in the show. And it eventually leads to some deaths in the family, but he kind of, there's a sort of a redemption towards the end of the program. It's an awful, terrible show, but it's an important one for the purposes that I'm kind of analyzing. There's a slightly better show that was produced, if I'm remembering correctly, around 2007, which is an interesting medical fiction about this doctor on the left who's a master surgeon, and his wife dies early on in the film, and then he has a visit from the guy you see on the right, who was a former patient of his, but had kind of disappeared, and he comes to console the doctor about the death of the wife. Gradually turns out he's actually Satan, and he has a plan. He wants to manipulate the doctor so that he does all kinds of nefarious things in the world, curing terrible people, killing good people, all in the operating room. And the Satan character is also a shapeshifter. He changes kind of bodies in order to manipulate and lead astray different peoples, and he mostly operates by way of whispering. And then there's this other show called 5 Kilometers to Heaven, 5 Kilometer Behisht, which is kind of like Ghost. The main character on the left is beaten over the head, and he doesn't die in this, but his ghost starts to wander around. He's in a coma, and he wants to solve the crime that has led to his attempted murder. So something that's really interesting in these shows is that they try to balance entertainment value with theological correctness, because the point in all instances is not just to entertain people, although that's obviously there, but it's also to teach them something spiritual, to remind people about the other world, to get them to be better people, these sorts of things. So they have to be entertaining, but they also have to be theologically correct. The kind of horror that they that they embody is usually about some kind of supernatural danger. Satan as a prominent character, as you saw in 2 of those cases. But most of all, I think it's really horror about sin. It's like the horror, the terrifying nature of sin, and what sin can do in transforming humans into worse and worse beings and driving them eventually towards hell. Now, because each of these shows has had to balance the question of theological correctness with entertainment, they've, in all cases, almost run into some kind of controversy. For one, what they're doing in almost every instance is they're making visible things that are supposed to be invisible. So the souls of the dead, Satan, in some cases, extraordinary powers like the ability of some people to see the true inner reality of other human beings, the nature of heaven and hell, these things, what heaven and hell look like, these things are all supposed to be invisible, and yet they're made into something visible in the films, and that presents certain problems. And there's a question of whether if they are meant to edify, if they are meant to instruct people, are they drawing on the wrong kind of theology, right? So part of that has to do with things like, can we actually represent as visible things that are supposed to be invisible? But there's other things like, what kind of power does Satan actually have? In one of these shows, Satan actually kills some people. And there's a question of whether that's actually possible from an Islamic theological standpoint. Perhaps a more important question, more significant question, is whether these shows are actually effective as pieces of spiritual instruction. Do they actually terrify people about sin? Are they sort of able to instill the horror of kind of transgressing against God, or do they do other things of the world, right? In both of these instances, there have been major controversies in the media about the shows that I've shown you and others that I have not talked about. So one that I think was really interesting with regard to this film in particular, with regard to Coma, was that there was a critical article written about the show where they drew on audience research in which a significant number of viewers said that they thought the favorite character, their favorite character in the show was the Satan character, right? So they most identified with Satan on the show. So clearly it wasn't, in those instances at least, doing the work that it was supposed to do, which is get people to embark on a path of spiritual improvement. So I want to leave it there and just say that it's extremely important to pay attention to the kind of conventions in different traditions of horror about what the films are supposed to be accomplishing, what kinds of relationships they imagine between the film and the viewership. Again, I think the example of prayers and Quranic utterances is extremely interesting, right? The idea that there can be moments of connection, not just in terms of sort of bodily resonance, but also in terms of the engagement in pious behavior and in uttering Islamic prayer. So what kinds of conventions are there in these films? What kinds of things do they assume about audience viewership, and what are they trying to do? And in the case of spiritual education, is horror really the best genre in order to for approaching that, or is it best left to other cinematic forms? And I think in Iran, at least, the conclusion so far has been that horror isn't doing the work that it's supposed to be doing, and we see newer kind of horror cinema, emerging horror cinema and television shows where the question of spiritual instruction seems to be a lot more subdued. There's more of an interest in kind of raising questions or provoking, and really just a lot more emphasis on the thrilling and horrifying dimension than anything having to do with spirituality. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, I'm next. So horror in the Southeast Asian context arises from pre-Islamic animist traditions and cosmologies that have at times merged with various faith traditions, whether it is Islam or Buddhism. So we're talking about beliefs in spirits that reside in nature, in the jungle, animals, and various geological structures, such as caves, hills, and mountains that are seen to be dwellings of spirits. These have not gone away in our modern contemporary times, but continue to coexist and hybridize into syncretic cultures. So in the Malay archipelago, and so this includes countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Brunei, are many spirits and supernatural beings, both malevolent and benign, that are kept alive by an enduring belief in their liminal existence. and perpetuation in folk and popular culture, they're often reinvented to respond to modernity and social change, or perhaps the pandemic. At the center of the pantheon of supernatural beings in the Malay archipelago are the bevy of the female undead. So these are ghosts and local vampires such as the Pontianak, the Kuntilanak, the Sundal Bolong, Mainak. There have been questions raised about why these supernatural beings in this region tend to be female. The answer could be is that they speak to the region's ambivalent attitudes towards femininity and female sexuality. So traditionally, gender relations in Southeast Asia have been shaped by bilateralism. So there have been few restrictions on women to work and enter relationships. However, the colonial and post-colonial period have completely remade gender relations in the region in the nationalist image. So much more militaristic, much more patriarchal. Matrilineal traditions in the region began to be phased out and lose their cultural relevance, only to be replaced by patriarchal modernity. So during the period of modernization and globalization in the late 20th century, women in Southeast Asia have emerged worldwide as low-status workers, either in manufacturing factories or as domestic workers, or in the service and entertainment or sex industries, who are mobile, uprooting themselves from the control of rural male guardianship and into the urban centers as financially independent single young women. So you have class-based anxiety towards female sexuality and women's reproductive capacities that have worked their way into the regimes of repression and control. So to give you an example, domestic workers from Southeast Asia are forbidden from falling pregnant and having romantic and sexual relations. They're denied time to travel to see their own children whom they have left behind. So in Muslim Southeast Asia, where the female undead reigns supreme, a similar anxiety about women is transmuted into horror narratives, enjoyed by a mainly working class audience. Several contrasting themes emerge here. Ideal femininity is defined by docility, but this definition of Malay femininity is not applied to women who are both threatening and non-threatening to the male order. The sexually experienced divorcee or widow or older women beyond reproductive age count as such women. Thus, women who transgress the convention of ideal Malay femininity, who embody access through their bodies, voices, comportment, and behavior, are all in close proximity to the terror of social and sexual disorder. So this brings me to the figure of the Pontianak, the fearsome birth demon of Malay folklore who is brought back from the dead after dying in labor. The name Pontianak is said to be a portmanteau of three words: perempuan mati anak, woman, death, child, or woman whose child has died. She's young and whose beautiful face may be hidden behind her long tresses. She can transform at will into a monstrous feminine with a ghostly pallor and long fangs to sink her teeth into her victims. She is by far the most recurring supernatural figure in Malay culture across the Malay archipelago, appearing in horror films since the 1950s. So this brings me to discussing the Pontianak's feminist potentialities, which are several and quite compelling. Traditionally, she is feared by new mothers whose newborn may be kidnapped and killed out of jealousy. But today, the Pontianak has been reimagined as an avenger of patriarchal violence, a bit like Kandisha. Men make the majority of her victims. She is a vigilante from beyond the grave, going after male miscreants. The Pontianak is traditionally thought to dwell on trees, where she easily camouflages against the foliage. But in films about the Pontianak since the 1960s, She may be a loving mother in a small village who must protect the public from her dangerous wayward children. But in much more recent reimaginings, the Pontianak lives in the city where she stalks the streets in search of villainous predatory men. Men's fear of the Pontianak is connected to the myth of female duplicity, that she's not as she presents herself to be, a beautiful young woman who may in fact be monstrous, murderous, and undead. So in my own interest in the Pontianak, I've paid attention to the sonic subjectivity of the Pontianak, how she's always laughing, her evil laugh, when she attacks or when she simply announces her presence. A woman who laughs loudly or with less innocent intent is seen as grotesque. Often we hear the Pontianak laugh, but we don't see her laughing. This disconnect between body and the source of voice is important in feminist film theorists who argue that the synchronization of women's voice and body reinforces her corporeality and embodiedness. So in other words, the desynchronization of voice and body displaces the unity of women as objects of the gaze. Through the Pontianak's sonic accesses, we find a potential for a female grotesque that is less embodied, less focused on the body as a site of resistance, and finds itself taking up space in a much more diffusive, much more mysterious way. So in conclusion, I would say that gender and sexuality are so central to the preoccupations of Muslim horror. And this is to do with the fact that femininity is so frequently strictly policed and so easily co-opted with ideas of transgression and access.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those really fascinating talks. I really appreciate how you each have quite a different perspective and a different interest in Muslim horror, but there are certainly certain themes, through which your interests collide. Those involve the way in which horror it could even be thought of as a spiritual or a religious genre, your interests in audience reception, and of course, this connecting thread of gender that showed up in so many of your talks. So the first thing, oh, and Sena, I really love that anecdote. You reminded me that I watched the KL24 Malaysian zombie movie with friends. And like for half of it, they were just, whenever anything appeared on screen that was either scary or in some cases sexualized, they were like, astaghfirullah, when some of those scenes showed up. So first thing I'd like you to do is I want to invite the panelists to respond to each other, for you to ask any of the questions that you might have or pull out any of the connections that you saw between your work. And while you're doing that, I would also like to invite our audience to submit their questions through the Q&A function, which you will see on the bottom of the screen. If you can type those in, and I will read them aloud for the panelists. So anyone?
I actually have a question about Candisha. The end. Alia, I know that you said something about the end, and of course, Kristian talked about it. Kristian, so the guy, but the person who turns out to be Candisha is not a woman, though, right? The Kabbalist is not a woman. It's a guy, or are you saying that there's some kind of a gender transgression that's going on in the movie as well as the creepy business?
Well, that's kind of what I was trying to think about, because in Clover's work, part of like the early kind of theorizations of the final girl, as you probably know, is talking about kind of her defeminization in a sense, and the kind of almost I think she talks about it she doesn't necessarily talk about it in a transgendered way, but she's thinking about like psycho and cross-dressing and this kind of thing. But so I was thinking about it in that context. Are we, is Candisha being transcoded in some way, that, by this kind of, expression through, kind of cross-dressing, basically, does that help her kind of demasculate these kind of oppressive men by castrating them, cutting off their head, maybe figuratively, cutting off their manhood in a sense. So I don't know. Also, I mean, it could be interpreted in different ways, right? I mean, we could think of it that this person is kind of like a vigilante and using the myth to justify, what he sees as just. Or, I mean, is this intended to be kind of this, bigendered, kind of mysterious spiritual figure that has become incarnate as the Kabbalist for our material moment, but is really the kind of spirit of this, female jinn figure. I don't know, but I wasn't expecting that to happen. I don't know if that's what you were talking about as well, Aaliyah, when you said you have thoughts, but I was trying to think of it in that context of kind of how the final girl has been considered, and when this idea of kind of a transgendered or transcoded type of gender identity, how it helps kind of push the final girl along. So not a good answer, I'm sure, but that is definitely what I was thinking about.
I like how you complicated that, because I was disappointed at the end of Kandisha. I felt robbed. I wanted my Kandisha female Avenger, but the Kabbalist figure is a complicated figure. He wears an awful lot of eyeliner for cisgender male. You know what I'm saying? So maybe there is an intention to cross lines there. And to complicate that, like as the line between living and dead is complicated, so the line between the genders is complicated in the movie. Kind of interesting.
I also wondered, with Kandisha, similar to you, Karla, was disappointed at the end of it. I was like, the film kind of resolves the tension. But then after this discussion, I wonder if it did in fact resolve the tension, because maybe it's the case that the Kabbalist is the servant of Kandisha, right? Which often happens with these types of figures, with these figures who deal with the jinn, right? If Kandisha is in fact a jinn and not just a human ghost, that he's doing her bidding, right? It's left, I think, ambiguous enough that could also be a possibility.
I wonder if Alireza and Sena, you can speak to each other about the way in which Islam has a kind of pedagogical role, or in the films that you are looking at.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, initially the sort of topic that I chose to speak to was because of my own curiosity at my own reactions. That when I first watched, sort of similar to your anecdote, Aliyah, like I must have made more dua watching Madayan than I have in like the week before, basically. Like the amount of like Bismillah, or like thinking about, like what when I was growing up in moments of fear, what was I taught Islamically to do when you are afraid of something paranormal or supernatural? And then seeing that sort of reflected in the case of Madayan specifically, spoke, I think, to an extent about how, and I don't know if it's unique to horror either, but horror and its use of terror and its use of also comedy and sort of resulting in a rush of adrenaline, making you sort of immediately go to what comforts you first or what makes you feel protected and safe first. In these particular contexts of Muslim horror, speaking to Muslim audiences, if falling back on like this sort of Islamic theological modes of protection of dua and prayer becomes invoked in that way. So I was really curious about Alireza, what you were talking about in terms of its pedagogical use, because I think the way that I was thinking of it was more of a reaction as opposed to its possibilities for teaching.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I wasn't thinking of prayer specifically, right? And I mean, your presentation really got me to think about that. I think though, if I were to sort of extend the line of thinking I had with the TV serials, which mostly were dealing with sin, right? The dangers of sin, the kind of horrifying effects it could have on people in terms of the sorts of beings they would become, the kinds of terrible things they would become capable of, right? But also what would happen to them, what their fates would be, right? The way they would endanger themselves, doom themselves, right? As beings who would eventually go to hell and things like that. And the kinds of harms they would bring to people around them, right? I think the horror is mostly around those things. But I think, and the pedagogy is essentially teaching people supposedly about those dangers, right? But I think maybe a way of thinking with regard to prayer to connect that would be that it wouldn't just be a kind of, I don't know, prophylactic or apotropaic, like a protective type of function, or even one that is just about sort of reducing your anxieties in the moment, but potentially as prayer as the kind of thing that over time and through repetition will make you the sort of person who is better guarded, is better protected, because you are more virtuous, because you're more pious and therefore closer to God and having more of God's protection, something like that. But yeah, I really love that, and I really want to think about it more.
So we have a number of questions from the audience, and I'll start off with one that seems that's fun, right, for all of you to answer. And maybe Alicia, you can start by answering it. One of our audience members would like to know, what are your favorite Muslim horror films? Alicia, you're muted.
You're muted.
Okay, yeah. So I think a bit like Kristian, I'm not really much of a horror movie watcher myself. I guess, for me, I think there is something to be said about what counts as a Muslim horror, So I would also say that a lot of the horror films from Southeast Asia that I have watched that happen to come from a Muslim majority country is almost a Muslim horror. So the work that I do is mostly, Pontianak films from the 50s, 60s, right up to the 70s and the 21st century. So because I watch so much of it and I find them so incredibly fascinating, they would, they have a lot to say about gender and sexuality to this day. It's still my favorite film. I'm boring like that.
Mm-hmm. Or not.
I have seen the movie Scream, so I'm going to take the fifth on that. That question. No, I'm joking though. But there's lots of different ways that you could take, there's lots of different ways that we get satisfaction from horror. So you could have lots of different, different favorite movies for different moods.
I think for me, my favorite is probably Under the Shadow, which you all screened 2 years ago, I think, right?
Yes.
That's probably my favorite. I think it's the best treatment of jinn I've seen so far. And in terms of the way it treats the problem of gender and the way it deals with war and with trauma, I think all of those things are really amazing. I have also a kind of a maybe I don't know if this counts as an answer, but I'll say it anyway. A Midnight Mass on Netflix. Oh, it's Catholic horror, but it does have a really important Muslim character, Sheriff Hassan, and I think it's really interesting. It's probably one of the best representations I've seen of Islam on screen in the United States so far. So I would encourage everybody to watch that. I wasn't fully satisfied with the treatment of Islam and Muslims because 9/11 had to show up there, and I hated that had to happen. But otherwise, I think it's really interesting.
Agreed.
I'll chime in because I was thinking the exact two same examples, both Midnight Mass and then Under the Shadow. Under the Shadow, because I really think it's a great film. I'm kind of a scaredy cat, so it's not super, fear-inducing, so I can handle it. But it kind of gets at some of these critiques that you're talking about, both kind of inducing this kind of terror, but then also kind of critical of these, broader social issues. And then the Midnight Mass, I just finished this like a week ago, and I was thinking the same thing. That and Squid Game. What's this new show? I know there's a Muslim character in that as well. I haven't seen it, but I was also thinking, like, well, what is the role of Muslim characters in these kind of other types of stories that are not kind of centered around Muslim narratives or these things. Another film that I don't know if we'd want to call it horror, but it's definitely like in the supernatural realm, is the film Atlantiques, which came out in 2019. And this film I thought was really great, also kind of commentary on the social realities, kind of men working in the diaspora and kind of what's going on at home, and how the kind of specter of their presence is kind of still affecting people. And that's on Netflix, so easy to watch as well. But yeah, that's one I like.
If I could jump in and pick up another one of the audience questions, because that's a good segue, Kristian. When somebody asked whether we would consider screening a movie like Clash as a horror movie, from the Egyptian movie. And we did talk about that. We had Hannah and I had long discussions about that the first year that we did Halaloween, if we wanted to screen political movies. Oh, sorry, did I cut you off, Alicia?
Sorry, it's okay, Karla, you can carry on. I was going to say something else. Yeah, it's okay, carry on.
Okay, sorry, I jumped in. We had a discussion about whether we wanted to screen political movies. And we decided not to, because they're so heavy, right? They leave you in such a dark place at the end. There's something about, Under the Shadow, I think it is a political movie, but it's also, it also is, there's something about it that's very cathartic. Watching it is cathartic. At the end of the movie, you feel lighter, I think, when you walk out. You know what I mean? In the same way that you do when you scream in a horror movie, you feel lighter when you walk out the door. You know what I mean? You purge the demons in a way. Under the Shadow, I think, is harrowing to watch, but it's also, there's catharsis at the end. At least for me, there was. I felt lightened a little bit. Atlantiques. In a movie like The Clash, the Egyptian political movie, they don't have that same kind of feeling. They're harrowing, and they leave you in a dark place often. And I think that was not the feeling that we wanted to go for in this series, which is why we chose not to screen those kinds of movies.
Mm-hmm. Alicia, do you want to say? Do you want to give us your response? And then I know, Sena, you need to tell us what your favorite horror movies are. You're muted, Alicia.
Sorry, I keep forgetting. Yeah, I actually was going to say something along the lines of, properly answering the question, because I was suddenly going blank, and now I realize there is a film that I really, really like that has got a strong Islamic theme that doesn't have to do with Pontianak or vampires, in fact, and it comes from Indonesia. It's called Satan's Slaves. It's called Pengabdi Setan. And it's a really good film because it's about a family that has been cursed by this ancient curse, and they're haunted by their dead mother, who is actually who's given birth to these children who are a bit like Rosemary's Baby. Their kids are cursed because they are tainted by Satan's blood. But the interesting thing about this film that I think has a commentary on religion is that the family who emerge, unscathed, and they live at the end of the movie, they are shown to be particularly un-Islamic. So they're supposed to be Muslims, but they don't pray. So they don't know how to recite the Quran. They don't know how to pray. They don't do it. They don't do anything, to the horror, of the ustaz who is supposed to rescue them. But the ustaz ends up being murdered by the demons instead, so by the devils that go after this family. So the film is, it's a remake from a much older original version in Indonesian film. So I'm sorry, I was actually going to say that Sorry to interrupt.
So I'll answer the first thing, which is I have two horror films that I love. The first one, I love the 1974 Turkish remake of The Exorcist called Şeytan. It is like, I think, such a good example of, so like the source material being very heavily imbued in Christianity, the fathers being the sort of saviors of the possessed Reagan in Washington, D.C., and the Turkish remake of it, which is just like, we're going to replace the priest with an imam. Every scene with a Bible is going to be a Quran instead. And it ended up being like sort of a cult classic because it is well, I'm not going to say it's notoriously bad quality because I think that's unfair to say about the production circumstances at the time, but I think it has sort of adopted a camp following as well. So I really do love that movie. And I think the second one is, and it sort of brings into question again our conversation about like what we qualify as horror and what fits within the genre, but I really do love A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. I know it's technically supposed to be an Iranian spaghetti western, and I actually do think it speaks a lot to Iranian like diasporic expression through the figure of the vampire skateboarding in a chador. But I think for the context of our conversation, I really do love that film as well.
Thank you, Hannah. And we have a number of questions here. So let's see what we can get through. So we have a question from Islam Jafal, who asks, I'm curious, what makes Kandisha a particularly Muslim film as opposed to a culturally Moroccan one? We can answer this in a kind of general way too, like how any of us are thinking about the difference between religion and culture.
You want to talk about that, Karla?
In terms of the selections that we make for Halaloween, we are always asked, this is obviously a question that we're always asking. I mean, we started this series with Girl Walks Home, which is an American movie. There's nothing Muslim about that movie. It was made in the US by an American director, from Iran, and in Persian, but it's an American movie. How do you make that call? That was kind of a cheat. And we started with that movie in part because we were screening these movies at the Michigan Theater, where, people tend to be kind of like snobs, art house movie snobs, and we wanted to ease into the pure genre stuff. And we started with that movie. My daughter's least favorite movie that we screened the first season, I will say, because I think she's kind of more of a genre fan. We're the criterion tends to be movies made in Muslim majority countries for a Muslim majority audience. I still would like to screen, movies from other, European movies, for instance, that have a prominent Muslim character. But it's really hard to find those kinds of movies. I mean, I agree that Midnight Mass, I really liked it, and I liked it in part because of the Muslim character, who I thought was, they did a good job with that. But it's really hard to find movies made in the U.S. or in Europe that treat the Muslim characters well. And to find a genre movie, a horror movie that does that is pretty difficult. I would consider that, but in the meantime, we really are like focusing on movies made by Muslim directors and or in Muslim majority countries and or for Muslim majority audiences.
Can
I just add? Oh no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sena.
I was just going to say, I think it's also useful. Just as we've been having this conversation, I've been thinking about Robin Armeens Coleman's horror noir and her definition and distinction between Black horror and Blacks in horror, where she identifies Blacks in horror as sort of the, even though there are characterizations of Black characters in the films, if the Blackness is identified as sort of a differentiating marker where racialized difference becomes hyperbolic of monstrous difference, for instance, that is an example of Blacks in horror in comparison to how she identifies Black horror as like specifically involving in the production, involving in the consideration of the reception, and in their characterizations, where Blackness is central to their construction of the characterizations, the plot, the narrative, as well as in some cases the monsters in some way. I'm not really doing full service to her argument in that way, but I think that ends up, importantly, I think to your question about is Kandisha a Moroccan cultural film or is it a Muslim horror film? I think it can be both in that way, where it is, I think, a specifically Moroccan production that also involves a Moroccan Islam in its consideration and its making of horror and its consideration of its audience. Because I think like a lot of, if you can compare jinn movies between different regions, I think they can all be classified as Muslim horror films, but there's something distinct in Turkish jinn movies versus like Iranian jinn movies, as we sort of discussed earlier.
Yeah. Kristian, I know you wanted to say something on this too.
Oh yeah, I mean, Sena said it beautifully, and I don't really have to say much more. But I'm working on, I think I'm here because I'm working on, what I might call Muslim cinema, quote unquote, and as opposed to being a big horror fan. So I've been thinking about this question because I think about what is this category of Muslim cinema? Can we have a category of Muslim cinema? And I appreciate that reference to Black horror versus Black sin horror. I'm going to have to check that out. But for me, I often think about Stuart Hall's idea about what is Black about Black popular culture. And, I see it similar in the ways to thinking about, Muslim popular culture in the sense that for me, I take, I guess, a kind of broad and capacious understanding that if the cultural product in its either production or its reception is informed by Islam, however that is locally interpreted, to me, that's going to be Muslim cinema or Muslim horror. So, for example, I wouldn't consider Midnight Mass to be Muslim horror, but certainly Kandisha or the Pontiac films or any of these other ones, they're both structured by how Islam informs the producers, how it informs the viewers as an audience in these Muslim majority contexts, and what being Muslim or what Islam means in those particular configurations is going to change. So a viewer of Turkish shaitan is going to maybe interpret it differently in Egypt from somebody in the diaspora in the UK, or if somebody watches it in Pakistan, but it's certainly informed by these kind of local understandings of what the religion means in these people's lives. So that's for me how I would answer that question. And I mean, I don't have to police the boundaries of that. That's not my concern, but that's how I use those types of categories of Muslim cinema or Muslim horror or something like that.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from our audience member, Ali Olumi, who asks, I am curious about how Muslim horror films interact with global horror. Do vampires or other Western themes and monsters make their way into Muslim horror? And in turn, do we think the jinn will make their way into horror, Western horror?
It seems they did in The Exorcist. Right. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking like maybe we should like reconsider The Exorcist as a jinn film, as opposed to like some sort of Catholic, Christian type of horror. But like, what would it mean if we understood it as a jinn film and like think about it in that global type of configuration? But yeah, I'll let others chime in.
I'll just say something very brief. I think Professor Ulumi has some great material for a script for a jinn movie. So you should do it.
Oh, is he making is that a pitch? An American director made a jinn movie. It's truly terrible. We screened, I watched it. Hmm?
Yeah, it like bombed. I don't think it got any over like significant cultural or national attention.
No, because it was very, very bad. Yeah. Yeah, no,
Which film is that?
Sorry?
What film is that?
It was called Jinn, and I'm blanking on who directed it. Was it hold on a second. Oh, here it is. I think it's the 2013 Jinn. Yeah, it's directed by Tobe Hooper. Yeah. which is, I mean, the man is one of the greats, but it was not a good movie. Yeah, but there's we were talking about, there's an Egyptian vampire movie from the 1970s, right? There are, that's, I mean, that's kind of why I introduced to the, my comments took the direction that they did, because I was looking at how what the genres that are familiar to us from Western and particularly American horror map onto like, kind of global Muslim horror, and thinking about like, kind of, what gets picked up and used and what doesn't. And I mean, other vampire movies from the Muslim world, I don't know if I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Well, I mean, Alireza, is A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night an Iranian vampire film or another kind of vampire film?
I mean, it was made by an Iranian, and it has some of the tropes of, it's like the oil town. There's the girl with the chador. There's like a luti type figure. The tough. So it certainly has some of those things in there. But the question of, is diasporic cinema Iranian? I think it is.
Yeah.
Something that annoys me about that film, even though I love it, is that the Persian is bad. But it's a really good film. Otherwise, and I think you could say the same about the diasporic dimension with Under the City, Under the Shadow. I think it was filmed in Jordan. It's so clearly not Tehran, and there's elements that are very wrong. But so much else about it is wonderful that I think it gets a pass. But yeah, it was made in the diaspora. It wasn't made in Iran.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from Priscilla Risky that I think maybe Alicia, you want to take a stab at. Horrible. I observed that in Indonesia, the horror movies were lately going away from the classic pattern of seeking protection from Islamic prayers and move towards more logical resolution, or even make us question our faith. Is that also happening in other countries? Is there any connection between this phenomenon to specifically Indonesia's diversity in faith?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I mean, I could go on a whole night, answering that question. I could sort of reiterate, one of my favorite horror film from Indonesia, which is Pengabdi Setan, Satan's Slave. And it really does address that thing where Islam is not going to protect you in the end, and it comes from a place where in Indonesia, there is already this great saturation of Islamic filmmaking. And when it reaches that saturation point, there is already a lot of cynicism and disaffection. I mean, I can't remember the person who had this theory of genre that in the beginning you have the golden age, and then towards the end it becomes like parody. So by the final stage of the Islamic film genre, Islam is taken with almost like a grain of salt, So it's no longer, this sort of pure idea that will protect you. And one of the things that I kind of want to raise that also responds to this is the Islamic Thriller, which also has terror and horror elements in Indonesia. And that comes out of the terror of deviant Islam. And one film that properly encapsulates that is the Self-Professed Prophet, or Mengaku Rasul. And this film is really interesting. It's an Islamic thriller about a guy who, self-styles himself as a living, latter-day prophet, and then, leads a community of cult members into, depravity, basically. And I think this kind of relates to Alireza's, Iranian type of terror of, the terror of sin, the terror of not following Islam correctly. And I think this is sort of something that becomes a little bit more relevant in Indonesia right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sena.
Alia, I'm so sorry for interrupting, but I just thought of something in response to the question before by I believe it was Ali, and the sort of the conversation about what, or have we seen sort of Western influences in horror in like the quote unquote Muslim world? And will we see jinn in Western film? And I'm again reminded of, I believe Professor Coleman writes about this in her book, but she cites Phillips, I think, where like understanding horror as sort of needing to be culturally relevant and like immediately identifiable as horrifying for it to operate successfully as horror. And so I think the anecdote that I usually tell my students is that like we don't really see like cursed puppet movies like in Turkey, or like we don't really see a lot of that happening. And the reason why, for instance, like Godzilla sort of emerged as a terrifying figure in Japanese film is because of the fear of what radiation was going to do to the natural landscape after World War II and the atomic bombing. And so I do think we have seen like vampire films in the 70s. We've seen a lot of like exorcism films, but in the context of jinn in the Muslim world. But I'm just curious about maybe how successful jinn movies will be in the US or in Europe, for instance, when part of my question is like, what can jinn movies offer to uniquely horrify those audiences that like regular possession movies with demon and Satan can't or haven't done in the past? And I think part of that has to do with understanding how your audience has been primed or understands horror or monsters to begin with. So that's also why I don't really see a lot of alien movies in the Middle East, when so many authors have written about sort of like the fear of quote unquote reverse colonization and why alien movies sort of increased in like the 80s and 90s here. So that was it. I would love if a jinn movie succeeded though here. I think that would be dope, but I don't know when that'll happen.
Thank you. We have a question from Hafizullah Nadiri, and that is the fairly broad question. What is the definition of a Muslim horror film for you or for any of us? And by the same token, especially since we were just talking about Midnight Mass, are there also Christian or Jewish horror films?
Well, I will just put out there that there's tons of scholarship on what we would think of as Christian horror. It's like a whole sub body of scholarship on how Christianity informs this, not only in films, but then also in like hell houses and like, the social reality of fear that's, contextualized in kind of embodied form. Yes, definitely Christian horror. Jewish horror, I don't know. I would imagine there would be, but I don't know any specifics about it.
There's the film about the Dibuk, right? Like I think there are Dibuk movies that are kind of similar to jinn in a sense. I haven't seen any, but I've heard that they do exist in the kind of you could say the Jewish horror genre.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've
also
already
about the golem. Sorry.
Oh yeah, the golem you were saying.
Yeah. Like their golem, the oldest one, and then there are a number of films about the golem that I think would qualify maybe as Jewish horror.
There's a 2015. Oh, I'm so sorry. I keep interrupting. I was just going to give a recommendation. There's a 2015 Polish horror film called Demon that also revolves around the Dibuk, and that one was screened at the Michigan Theater like 4 or 5 years ago. That one is also very, very good. So.
I think that having retconned The Exorcist as a jinn movie, I think that's like, mic drop, we walk away, our work is done here. But I mean, all horror kind of has this pagan element to it too, right? I think the shout out to Katla, which is a great Icelandic horror thing that was on Netflix. I think that it started in September. It's an Icelandic limited series, and really good. I actually really liked it. It's very slow burn, kind of very kind of family centered, very gray, very kind of northern Iceland. But I feel like horror always has this. It draws on these deep pagan roots. That kind of get sifted through, Muslim or Christian or Jewish culture, but the fear that is at the heart of them is often feels identical across those different cultures, and feels like something deeply pagan, atavistically pagan at its heart.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think Pi by Darren Aronofsky, that also could be considered a Jewish horror film. I mean, the Kabbalah is so central to it. You know, Hasidic sort of Judaism is extremely central to it. Anyway, and it's such a great film.
We have a next question from Francisco Blanco. Are there any American horror movies that portray Muslim folklore creatures like the ones you mentioned, which has some overlap with the questions that we were thinking about before? Are there jinn in American horror movies or any other Muslim folklore creatures?
So when I was trying to figure out kind of my take, and I started to, search about Kandisha, there's actually a 2020 film named Kandisha that was made by two well-known French horror filmmakers. I can't remember their name right now, but that seems interesting to me. I was going to think about kind of the visual representation of these two figures. As you saw from mine, the Kandisha in this Moroccan film presented her in a very particular way. I didn't watch the other film because I didn't have access to it, but it seems like it's created in a very kind of orientalized fashion. Did you get to see this, Karla? Or
yeah, it's on Shudder. I watched it. Yeah, it's very orientalizing, and I mean, there's some, like at the beginning, especially, I really like it. It's set in in Paris, and it's a neighborhood with Muslims from a lot of different parts of the world, and so there's that nice kind of that urban European urban feel to it. But it does get kind of orientalizing. I would recommend the comic series Infidel, Image Comics, I think it is. It's actually kind of nice. I mean, it's got some Muslim themes. It's an American comic. The writer is not actually Muslim, but I thought they did a good job with it. It's not a movie, but it's fun.
We have a question from Maisha Ahmed that's specifically about Madain. In the movie Madain, there are multiple tales about what's haunting the area, from the remnants of the Thamud tribe to camels to jinn. What do you make of all these different spooky figures haunting one area?
Well, I think that comes up a lot in a lot of horror films, specifically if we follow like the found footage sort of genre, where it's like there is a place that everyone warns you not to go to, and there's always going to be a group of people with a notebook or a camera who wants to go and either prove that it's not going to happen or prove that it is. And so the sort of like the tethering of particular monsters or creatures to a location is very much part of like horror genre, since it's like cinematic sort of visual inception. Yeah, it's either that or some creature came away from another region that no one can reach anymore and has now traveled and made its way to regions that are more familiar.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it almost seems oversaturated, especially for Saudi Arabia, where it's not a place where people would necessarily think of as being saturated with supernatural figures, right? That is not part of the Saudi narrative in American discourse. It's oil, it's terrorism, etc. We have a question from an anonymous audience member on gender. Do you think that the depiction of women and feminine supernatural beings will change as culture changes? I guess assuming that culture will change. Do we see a shift happening?
I was thinking about this a little bit with regard to this new Iranian horror anthology series that came out at the end of the spring. It's called Them on Ha. And the second episode is a jinn story about childbirth and a jinn who kind of wants to take the baby away. There's a certain kind of family debt. And there's an interesting exploration of gender. There's things that shows like, it very deliberately focuses on the man in the family caring for the baby. It's like the man who puts the baby to sleep, but also the man who in some sense is responsible for the fate that befalls the family because of the jinn. So it seemed to me like it was indicating some shifts, but then it was also reproducing certain tropes about like the superstition of the women. It's like his sister who actually introduces him to this kind of sorcerer type character who then brings the jinn into the family. So it seemed to me like an interesting case where certain kinds of shifts were being negotiated, even if they're not fully sort of there's not a full break with kind of gendered representations of superstition and so on. But it did seem to indicate something in that direction.
Yeah, can I also answer as well this question? I would say yes, there is a shift in the sense that the horror is no longer, the supernatural being herself, but rather patriarchal violence is the horror. So I would give an example of like a new film that came out maybe about a couple of years ago by a Malaysian independent filmmaker, Amanda Nell Yu. And she made this film called, loosely translated as It's Easier to Herd Cows. And it's like the local version of Let the Right One In. I don't know anyone if you've seen that. It's like a friendship, story, but overlaid with vampires, So it's like that, but it's like a friendship between two girls. One of them is the vampire who lives in a tree, and then the human friend is a shy girl who can't seem to figure herself out. But the real patriarchal violence is, the father of this vampire girl is, he abuses her, and he is the horror. He is the source of terror, and I think that's the shift that we are seeing.
There have been some strong central female characters in the movies that we've screened too. I mean, Under the Shadow, that woman is fierce in that movie, and Dashara too, which is a movie that we screened in the first 2019. There's a central female character in that who's also, she's so she doesn't survive. I'm sorry, but she fights to the end. She's just tough AF. She's a very strong character. So there are some strong characters in these movies.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from Maisha Ahmed about Madain. Madain Saleh is said to be haunted after the people defied Allah and the Prophet Saleh. Are there other geographical areas that are said to be haunted after defying a prophet? That's a really interesting question.
I'm going to suggest tweeting at Dr. Ali Alumi about that one and seeing if you get an answer. I have no idea.
Good
I mean, I guess
suggestion.
it would be, yeah. What prophets are we thinking about here? There's overlap in Old Testament prophets. Are there any movies about not people who defied Moses, but Moses himself? Well, yeah, I guess I don't want to say 10 Commandments, but like horror movies about that involve maybe like Moses himself, his defiance, or Abraham's conflicts, their defiance.
These sound like great pitches. I would watch these.
I mean, the Indiana Jones film with the what is it called? I mean, it's not horror, but there's the what is it called? The Nazis who want to steal the
Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant, exactly. And
Raiders
what the Ark of the Covenant, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Thank you. Doesn't quite match what's being said, but there's prophetic sort of vengeance in a way, you could say.
Mm-hmm. We have a question about this.
Aaliyah, can I say one thing real quick? Going back to the last question. I'm thinking more of like from a North American and possibly even kind of European context, but I think part of is there a shift happening towards these more gender egalitarian type of narratives, or these? I think part of that we would have to think about production and industry. And I think at least in, like in the kind of festival circuit and independent films and these kind of things, there does seem to be shifts to support writers, filmmakers who are not getting the kind of industry support that others that are getting to make films do. So that might kind of enable a change. So like just recently, The Blacklist, which is this kind of like well-known film writing kind of, they kind of shop out titles to big movie houses. They did one focused, they called it the Muslim List, which was kind of a strange name, I thought, but still it was like highlighting like Muslim narratives, film writers to kind of get those greenlit. And then there's other kind of, lots of the independent films that have showed up on like things like Netflix and others, not necessarily horror, have like, gotten support from Sundance or other things like this. In the various stages of like writing their film, producing their film, these kind of things. So those kind of things I think would need to be amplified if we want to try to get more and more these kind of progressive voices, if we want to call it that, or at least just even a wide variety of stories. And I think more broadly thinking about like Muslim cinema or others, this is the problem, is that there's only like one of this, or there's only like a handful of this type of film, that if it like bombs, then like there's no motivation to say, oh well, let's give it another shot, even though there's like 50 films about the same story revolving around a group of white friends or whatever it might be, and they keep getting the same shot. So I think that's a key part, which that's not something I'm really focused on either, and it doesn't sound like many of us here are thinking about the kind of industrial production of film, but I think that's a key part in thinking about how we might get different narratives, especially ones related to gender.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kristian. We have a few more minutes, so let's see if we can take one or two more of these questions. We have a question about, in Islamic or Muslim horror, is there a similar trope that exists in Western horror, where marginalized identities like global minority races or queer people or disabled people die before others? Interesting in this context.
We have kind of the repertoire among the movies that we've seen. Between us, we've seen a fair few movies, right? But I still don't know if we have like a kind of a repertoire to be able to answer a question like that. Yeah.
I mean, maybe it can be, we can sort of frame it as like people who are minoritized or oppressed identities within the society in which the film is set, if they die first.
It's not a trope that I can remember in the movies that I've seen, but
yeah. Maybe, Alicia, can you maybe think about that in the context of KL24? Because we do get some discussion about, the relationship between Muslims and Christians in Malaysia.
Yeah, so the thing I find it really interesting about KL24 is that, it's a different kind of horror, for Malaysian filmmaking altogether, because I think it completely bypasses a lot of religious issues altogether. What it's really saying is that because Malaysia is a multicultural society, there is a lot of racial division and segregation, and there is not a lot of cohesion across ethnic lines. So in KL24, we find that it takes a pandemic, to bring people from different ethnic groups together. So one of the recurring tropes that we find in a lot of Malaysian films with different ethnic groups, different religious groups, is the theme of interfaith marriage or interfaith romance. So the final girl, you know, in KL24 is she was well known for acting in this much earlier film called Sepet, which is like an interfaith, you know, romantic drama, and she's a Muslim girl, and then she falls for a Chinese boy who's Buddhist. And so we see her again doing this interfaith relationship, which doesn't seem to get anywhere simply because, you know, things happen. So so I think it's just using, you know, a horror trope, the zombie pandemic, as a way of overcoming, you know, racial division. So I think that's how I see it.
That's great. We have another question from Hafizullah Nadiri, asking, I guess, a question that we can spend a long time talking about. Can movies with a terrorism theme be considered as Muslim horror, especially those that contain hostage taking?
Personally, I would group these into like similar to like the Midnight Mass type of horror, where I wouldn't call that, you know, quote unquote Muslim horror. Of course, it's horror inducing, but it seems to be informed by kind of Western stereotypes about what Muslims and Islam is all about, rather than kind of informed by any kind of insider's perspective of what that tradition might mean, you know, across its you know, global variations. So I would certainly say that's not, you know, I wouldn't categorize it that way personally.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting though, because I think in some cases, and I could talk about this forever because I've thought about The Exorcist for so long, but we've seen some examples, at least in US horror films and Hollywood films, where the sort of conversation around the possession of a person, where their body is taken hostage from them, ends up sort of like acting as allegory for hostage taking in that way. And in a lot of cases with the particular history of considering Muslims as uniquely sort of sexually aberrant as well as terrifying. This conversation around like, what does it mean if an alien, like in the case of Hellraiser, right, if a sadomasochistic alien race comes and kidnaps you and tries to torture you because they find pleasure from it, what does it mean that they're like, the box they come out of is always coming from Morocco, right? So is that like, that isn't as explicitly as hostage taking in the case of sort of, I think we saw an increase of that in Hollywood action movies, especially after the Munich hostage crisis and post 9/11, but definitely through the allegory of sort of more popular horror tropes. I think we've seen that allegorized and like referenced to.
Mm-hmm. We have a question that might be for Alireza. Are horror TV shows common for Ramadan in the Muslim world worldwide, or is it mostly Iran?
I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. I mean, I imagine Egypt, you know, Jordan, those places are what we'd have to look to see if they have Ramadan horror shows. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm curious though.
I mean, Ramadan serials are such a huge thing in Egypt that I think you're right. That might be where we might look first.
One of the things that's, I think, really interesting about Ramadan TV serials in Iran, at least, is that they tend to be rush jobs, because what happens is, because they have to be broadcast during Ramadan, and almost every year there's some kind of call, I think, within the circle of producers and directors and so on, and then but the decision as to who's supposed to be making what TV series comes very late, and then they're basically shooting the shows as they're, and so often there's, you know, they have no idea how they're gonna end the show. They just have kind of like a general idea. So and also they stretch out like a flimsy concept for 30 days or something like that. So they tend to be really bad. But there are a few instances where there's actually something interesting going on.
Yeah.
From what I know about the, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say quickly that we have a direct chat from, where someone says Egypt mostly has thrillers or mysteries, not really horror, but Egypt did have the first ever Ramadan horror show. It's on Netflix called Paranormal. Sorry, Kristian.
That's Ma Wara al-Tabi'a, right? I didn't know that that was a Ramadan show.
We'll have to get Hannah, and she was the one who mentioned this.
Yeah.
All I was going to say was, from what I know of like the Egyptian production, cycle and schedule, it's very similar to what you're describing in Iran. Is that it's kind of rushed and then stopped and then rushed again, and so you get the similar type of kind of physical material production of the Ramadan specials.
Turkey has so much more horror, you'd expect them to have more Ramadan horror, right?
So I think we are at time. That was a wonderful conversation, all right? Thank you so much for all of your input. Thanks to all our guest speakers and our audience members for attending today. I invite you to check out all of our guest speakers' books and their work for further information on what they do. And then as a reminder, if you want to hear about similar events from U of M Global Islamic Studies, including the rest of our Afghanistan speakers and a film, please sign up for our Global Islamic Studies newsletter. So thank you so much to everyone for attending and for this awesome conversation about Muslim horror.
Thank you.
You all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Those were great talks. Learned a lot today.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the questions
me
were great
too.
too.
You've inspired me to watch more horror.
Be brave. You have to watch the Halaloween movies because they're not too bad. They're not too scary.
Yes,
I
they've
think
been
I was
divided.
actually looking at the rating. The ratings you had were really helpful.
Oh yeah, I like that.
I think it helps to intellectualize.
Question, like who chose KL24 as part of this year's Halloween?
I watched it first. I watched it on YouTube with no subtitles, so I didn't really know what was going on a lot of the time. But then we included, because we kept on saying to the audience, where are the Muslim zombie movies? And this is when somebody suggested it to us, and I watched it, and I said, yeah, we want some of that.
Yeah.
Someone, when I was asking online, somebody mentioned a film named Zibakana from 2007, which is about zombies, I believe. And then there was
really?
an older one, yeah, Pakistani movie, and then a really old one called Zindalash in 1967. And that one might be a vampire one. But I was wondering, I was actually thinking about this when you were talking. It sounds like you're kind of almost developing a typology, Karla, and it seems like, especially when Sena, you mentioned this Turkish exorcism remake too. It seems like that for much of kind of the early 70s, 80s, like that's kind of the Muslim horror that's out there is like remakes basically. Maybe that's different from the Southeast Asia context. It sounds like there are these kind of localized kind of horror type, I don't know if we want to call them horror in all the cases earlier on, but it seems like elsewhere there's not really these kind of localized traditions being articulated, or jinn or these kind of things, until later. So I wonder why that shift happens.
Yeah, I have no idea. Oh, my dogs are, you guys, I have to let my dogs out. They're they're mutinying.
Well, looking forward to talking more.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope we can continue, because I would love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thanks again,
Yeah.
everybody. It's great.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Meeting
Thank
some of
you.
you.
All right, thank you.
Take care.